So yeah, okay, I got it. It's being recorded. Yes, so decolonization as default perspective in language documentation. And hopefully when we get to the end of the talk, you'll have a sense of what I mean by this and why I've titled my talk this way. Yes, here we go. So a brief outline of what I'm doing today. I'm going to give a brief and simplified, very much so, history of the field, just to try to give the context for my work as a documentary linguist, and for the people in the audience who might not be familiar with the field of documentary linguistics. Also, I'll give a few case studies in the Himalayas. Just got a few that I've picked out, and then I'll talk about my work really as a case study within this, field of language documentation. The best, at least my favorite part of the talk is when I actually talk about the language itself. And so I've got stuff on the genius of Kurtöp. This is actually this use of the term genius to describe a given language, actually I think is attributed to Edward Sapir, but I couldn't find the source of the quote when I was putting this together. Anyway, we'll see some stuff on Kurtöp and why it's such a great language. And then the concluding thoughts, I'll try to wrap it into the context of this series at the end there. Okay, so we're starting with Franz Boas, and I'm not sure who's in the audience is already familiar with him. I had to do some more research about him myself. Of course, he was one of the first names that you hear about when you're doing a PhD at the University of Oregon, when you do field work. You know anything about Native American languages, Franz Boas comes up. But it turns out he was a physicist, an anthropologist, and is contributed to intellectual debate and knowledge around the world in many different domains. For our purposes here, he's really known for his holistic work on language. So he wouldn't just go out and kind of cherry pick a few words and put them out there. He wanted to produce a grammar of a language, a dictionary of the language, and then a collection of the texts. And this down here is just a few of the texts he's put together. So in linguistics, a collection of texts in this case means he would go around and record people. I guess this was been before, digital recorders. So you'd have to listen and handwrite the stories that the elders often would tell you, the folklore, the traditions, whatever the spoken language is, it gets written down, put into paper as a text. So that's how you go from the oral language to a text in documentary linguistics. And the three of these together is what's known as a Boasian trilogy. And this is often what the people aim for when they're doing a documentation project, is to get something like this: the grammar, the dictionary, and the texts. So that's the kind of the methodological backing behind this this work that I do. And then there's been some great intellectual contributions from this very holistic perspective. You get some really great intellectual contributions. So I've got on here the first bit of an article that he published on alternating sounds. And this is, his idea is so common in linguistics today, it's hard to imagine people saw language anyway differently in the past. But it used to be, the idea was, if I think we've all actually trying to learn a new language. We hear sounds for the first time and we really struggle to get them right, or they might sound one way in one context or one way in another. We try to pronounce them and we know we don't sound right, and so on. The idea before Boas was that in a lot of, especially these non-European languages, the speakers were just a bit lazy. They weren't doing things properly. The sounds weren't organized. And Boas was the first person to go and say, hey, wait a minute, you guys, it's not that the languages are disorganized. It's that you're biased by your own perception on what you're hearing. You're influenced by your own native language, and that's affecting the way you're hearing the sounds. So he talks about this, making an analogy with color blindness and so on. And this over here, I just wanted to read a little bit from this particular quote. He gives some evidence for why the Native American languages are, equally as organized as European languages, and says, it is clear that all such misspellings are due to a wrong apperception which is due to the phonetic system of our own language. And then he goes on to expand on his thesis there. So this was a really powerful observation first made, as far as we know, by Boas. Okay, and then just to kind of summarize the take-home point of his work in linguistics this way in terms of theory, we are biased against hearing sounds in our own native language. And then the job as a linguist should be to describe the sounds in the given language in its own terms, all right? So this is a really important theoretical contribution that was made. And I just thought I would illustrate this with an example. So I'm not sure who in the audience is familiar with Devanagari for Hindi, for example. I thought actually I should pick Tibetan for this audience, but then the Tibetan writing system is so complicated for reasons that go beyond this talk. I thought, no, we'll just stick with Hindi because they've really stuck with one character for one sound sorts of principles. So anyway, if you've taken, an introduction to Hindi class, and if you speak a language like English or German as your native language, and they tell you there's a sound da that differs from ta, that differs from da, that differs from da, and these are all different from the and ta and the and da. At least in my experience, it was so hard for me to hear the difference between all of these because English only has these two sounds. So I would hear, if I heard a ta and a ta, I would say, oh yeah, that sounds like the English T. And I would probably say it back that way until the teacher finally clued me in that with this one here, I had to curl my tongue back. And in this one, the tongue had to touch the teeth. And then for all the other ones, the da, the da, the da, the da, the da, the da, I heard most of these as a da. And when I tried to say them again, I would almost come up this way. So, it's, for a native Hindi speaker, these are all clearly distinct sounds. But from my poor English ears, it was really, really hard to hear the difference. So this is the sort of observation that he made. And I did have to give one example from the Himalayas here. So I have just something from my own work in Kurtöp. We'll see more on Kurtöp in a little bit. But here is me basically doing all of this for Kurtöp. So here's all the sounds written in the International Phonetic Alphabet, and then a romanized grapheme or digraph to represent those sounds, or in some cases, a trigraph. And then an example word. Okay, so one of the first jobs as a documentary linguist is to figure out what all of these different sounds are in the given language, and then then you have to choose some symbols to represent them. So the IPA here is the great tool that linguists have. All right, so like I said, just to give an example of this point that Boas made about the non-alternating sounds, that actually the sounds that we hear as kind of different or varying are just very as well organized in all languages. They're equally well organized. They're just different from language to language. Okay, continuing on with our trajectory of the history of the field, one of Boas's students was Sapir. And he's also famous for his work on Native American languages. And I have here the map that he drew on the classification of North American languages. So he, took Boas's ideas about describing these languages, as equally organized as European languages, took it a step further and was able to apply comparative and historical methods to the languages in the Americas to talk about how they're grouped and related to each other. So this is just an example of that work. And he's also got some great contributions to our understanding of language and how we think about language. And this is one article that was published with his student, Morris Swadesh, after his death, entitled American Indian Grammatical Categories. Actually, the part that you can see here mostly is talking about the breadth of diversity in the languages of the Americas. But the take-home message of this article was that these grammatical categories in these languages are really their own sorts of things. It's their own way of organizing the language into different categories than what we have in European languages. And we'll see this in Himalayan languages also. So he really made a big point that we really, like, with Boaz, we have to think about the languages and their own sounds. Well, Sapir also made this point, but applies to everything in the language. We have to conceptualize these languages according to their own grammatical categories. Prior to this work, in the Americas, there was a tendency for people to try to take the languages that they found and force them into Latin or classical Greek grammatical categories. So you see a lot of old, old descriptions of languages from Mexico, for example, written in Spanish, and they basically just took like the perfect, the pluperfect, and all of these Latinate categories and found a sort of equivalent in whatever the Native American language was, as if you're translating. And Sapir is like, points out the languages don't work this way. They work in their own way. And there's another quote of his that I've got. This is kind of thinking about the language as an entire system. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. We see and hear and otherwise experience very largely as we do because the language habits of our community predispose certain choices of interpretation. So again, we're all kind of biased a bit to our perception of the world based on our own language and culture. Okay, so I am now going to, this was published after his death in the 1940s. I'm going to skip 60 years or so of the history of the field, although I could fill you in on some details if you wanted. And I'll go to something that really started to take off in the early 2000s, which is a collaborative methodology in language documentation. So you can already begin to see maybe how this would develop. If you're trying to understand the language from the language's point of view, the best people to do that are the ones who speak the language, okay? So if you involve them in the work from the beginning, you're just going to be able to shortcut faster to the end result of understanding the language in its own terms. So people quickly worked out that we will work better if we involve the native speakers in our projects, and there's a whole host of research in this domain that I'm completely skipping over, but I've just picked out a few examples because I know them well. So I've just got one article here by a colleague of mine, Raquel. She and I did our PhDs together, and she actually started doing her PhD because she had been working in Suriname as a Peace Corps volunteer, and the people she was working with were like, oh, we speak this language. Now I can't even remember the name of it. Anyway, it's in the article, but it's not written down. It's being replaced by something else. We want our children to be able to keep learning it. We want our children to read and write it. Can you do something as a volunteer to help us with our language? So she had done something else for her undergraduate degree, but thought, okay, sure, yes. Went to find a PhD program just so she could do a PhD helping these people in Suriname with language documentation and revitalization efforts in that area. And she, this was from a meeting in 2010 where they do these big training sessions. She brought a group of them from Suriname to take the training, learn the methods, go back and do their own research. And she's since finished her PhD and has an academic career, but still very much tied with the community there. And that links directly in with Infield. So this photograph was taken from Infield in 2010. And what Infield is, it's now actually called Colang, but it was established as Infield in 2008 by Carol Giannetti at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as a way to give training to native speakers and community members themselves so they could go back to their own areas and do their own language documentation projects. After 2010, sometime they realized, it's really what we're talking about is collaborative fieldwork. So they changed it to Colang. And if anybody's curious, it happens every 2 years. There's one this year. You can click on the website and see the history of it and where the next Colang is happening. So those are two examples of this collaborative methodology that's been going on. And then I just wanted to mention one other example is Nora England's work at the University of Texas in Austin. I know when she was hired for her job as a professor there, I think in 2001, she negotiated several scholarships for native indigenous community members from Mexico to come and have scholarships to do PhDs in language documentation in Texas as part of her startup. She's like, if I'm going to come and be your professor, you're going to give me scholarships to give these people from Mexico come and get training so they can go do their own language documentation. So I thought that's another fantastic example. Like I said, there's several others, but I'm just picking the ones that are my favorite and that I know best. All right, so this is, I think, the trajectory from Boaz to Sapir to this collaborative methodology. And now we can look at how this has been extended into the Himalayas. So I'm just going to click on a few links here. Let's see, does this work? Okay, so this should show the Nubri language project. You guys should all see this. So this is happening in Nepal, spearheaded by Catherine Donahue, who you can see there. There's some, you can see some things about the language, some linguistic description stuff, about the documentation, and they've managed, I just thought this was nice. So they, one of the important things when linguists are doing field work is the idea of collaboration, it should be in whatever sense that people would like you to collaborate with them. So in this particular case, they wanted people to come and help with eye problems. So they managed to arrange this eye clinic as part of their documentation. They had a medical aspect run by medical professionals, but kind of tied in with the language documentation work that she was doing. So this is mentioned there. Anyway, you can look through this more if you want to on your own. And then, yes, okay, another one. Going further east into Arunachal Pradesh, this is work done by my colleagues at Sydney Mark Post and Yankee Modi, who are a team of researchers. Did they come up here? Yes, okay, so here are the directors. So my colleague Mark, my colleague Yankee. Yankee herself is an indigenous linguist from Arunachal Pradesh. She got a PhD from the University of Bern in PhD in linguistics from the University of Bern. And both of them have really devoted their academic careers to training community members in Northeast India to do language documentation themselves. And you can see this is some of these workshops that they've been running. I think that's what TRICO stands for. I forget what all the acronyms are, but this is some, there we go, training and resources for Indigenous community linguists. And they've got this SLICE program. This one I didn't hear about it until I was looking this up today, Sustaining Languages Through Indigenous Community Empowerment. All right, and then this is just about a kind of umbrella organization. Okay. And I know that Mark and Yankee are there right now, actually, and involved in some of the work while they're not teaching, presumably going back to Sydney this month. All right, so there's several other projects like this also, I should point out. So like I said, I just picked a couple that I know well. And now we can go to my work, which is much less impressive in scope compared to these. But nonetheless, I like to think that I've had this perspective in mind, and hopefully I've done some good linguistics with it, or decent stuff anyway. All right, so my own work began in 2006. Actually, the next slide says it began in 2005. Depends on how you started. Anyway, so it's several years. This is 15 years, over 15 years of collaboration. Lots of collaborative work with Karma Tsering, who is a native Dzongkha speaker. Lots of collaborative work with Kinga Hlendrup, who's a native Kurtöp speaker. And both of them have received PhD scholarships for to do a PhD in linguistics. So that's trying to follow through with this tradition that we give the training to the people who speak the languages. They're the ones who are best equipped to do the job. And then I've just, in terms of my own work, I've done field work on several other languages in Bhutan: Phokbu, Black Mountain Munpa, Chali, Boomtap, Kenka, Upper Mangdep, especially Popjeep variety of it, Thashasili, and Zala. So just to give a sense of my background there. All right, now, all right, so I'm going to say a bit more about Kurtöp documentation, but before that, I wanted to give a linguistic overview of Bhutan. So here's a map of Bhutan. The languages in these are languages here with black circles around them, more or less. And these are my favorite ones because they're the East Bodish languages, which is what Kurtöp is. They're sort of possibly cousins to the Tibetic languages. So maybe the parent language to East Bodish was a sister language to Classical Tibetan or Old Tibetan or something like that. And they're all spoken around here. They're not the only languages in Bhutan. In addition to those, we've got Gongduk, which is a tiny language spoken by about 500 speakers over in this area. Karma Tsering was doing a PhD on that language. Black Mountain Munpa, spoken by maybe up to 1,000 speakers in a few different villages in this area. And then Flokbu, spoken in the southwest, kind of down near Samtsi. Now, these three languages all belong to the Tibeto-Burman family, but as far as anybody knows, they don't know where they fit. So there's probably at least several thousand years of separation from each of these languages from any other language in the family. So if the sense to which there's an indigenous linguistic population in Bhutan is encapsulated within these three linguistic groups. There's been some genetic studies, population genetics in Bhutan, and that population genetics also matches with the linguistics, that these people are genetically distinct, they're linguistically distinct. They've been in this area for a long, long time as indigenous Bhutanese populations. And they're very small minorities, and the languages are highly endangered. You talk to the people in these areas. In fact, they don't even identify themselves as being Bhutanese. When they say Drup, they mean the other people, not them, and similar in these other places. I could say a lot more about that, but that's not the point of today's talk. The other languages here, we've got Tsangla. This is also called Sharchop, a big language spoken in Eastern Bhutan and also in Arunachal Pradesh. In India, Dzongkha, so this is the national language of Bhutan, the only one that's got a written history, and this is a descendant of Classical Tibetan or Old Tibetan, and is written with Uchen like Tibetan is. Most the other languages don't have their own writing system historically. Of course, we all know Nepali, spoken in the south. Tibetan has been an influencing force probably over the past 1,000 years in Bhutan, coming down with the Tibetan Empire and certainly with Buddhism being spread in the area also. And then we've got Hindi spoken in Bhutan. That's come mainly through television and movies since 2000. And we've also got English there as the language of instruction in the schools. So I just, yes, before getting into Kurtöp, I thought it was important to talk about the linguistic situation in Bhutan, because as you'll see in a little bit, the people are so multilingual here. So when you talk to a Kurtöp speaker, it's really, really hard to find one who only speaks Kurtöp. They will almost always speak Dzongkha as the national language. If they've had a traditional education, they'll have learned Tibetan. I mean, they literally get some of these grammatical forms from Tibetan beaten into them in the schools. If they've gone to Eastern Bhutan, they'll have learned Sangla. If they had Nepali friends growing up, they'll speak Nepali. They've learned some Hindi, and if they've gone to school, you know, for a few years, they'll know some English. And the speakers often switch between these languages daily, mid-conversation. And I discovered this the hard way during my fieldwork because I had to, you know, in order to understand what was Kurtöp, I had to also understand what was Dzongkha and what was Tibetan and what was Tsangla, because I was peeling layers out of the conversation trying to get to the language I was trying to study. And this is just the way people speak in this part of the world. And actually Bhutan is not unique. There's other places that are very multilingual like this. And then just a quick point, I've simplified this a little bit. So there's a few other Tibetic languages that are spoken in here that are not on here. But these would be more recent migrations from Tibet. All right, so now I can talk about my work again. And it was fun to think about the history of my research on Kurtöp, and we can see a picture of young Gwen with Pema Chofel, the first Kurtöp speaker I met in 2005 when I started my PhD program at the University of Oregon. He was there as a student studying business, and somehow our department came to know about him and, oh my gosh, he speaks this language that's never been described. What is going on? We're going to have him for our field methods consultant. So I did a year-long course with him to learn the language. And before that, I knew I wanted to work on Tibeto-Burman languages of the Himalayas. And I thought, this is it. This is what I've got to do for the rest of my life, is follow this guy to his village and see what happens. And eventually I did. But before that, because we're already wanting to try to work holistically with the language. It's not just to, ask him how to count to 10 and point out some body parts and stuff. We really wanted to get some conversation and some naturally occurring data. We found another Kurtöp speaker in California, which is just like a couple-hour flight from Oregon. So that's Pema and I on the plane. We flew down, actually with Raquel also, to meet Kazan, so we could record some conversation between the two of them. So that was back in 2005 already. I'll say something about that data in a minute in the context of other types of data that we've got. And then just more about the project in general. So I got funding for the project in Bhutan, really in 2007, and started most of the field work there. And some of the first outputs, there's a bunch of academic papers that I'm skipping over, but ones that are relevant for this line of work, in particular, worked on developing an orthography or writing system for the language in Uchin, which was not an easy task at all. I'm happy to talk about that if anybody's interested. There's the publication about it. There's the grammar. So I had my PhD in 2011, but revised the grammar quite a bit to be published in 2017. And then this dictionary, yes, it's supposed to have been done to the publisher several years ago, but I'm convinced it's going to happen sometime this year. I'm actively working on it a lot, and you'll see a lot of it, or a few entries of it anyway, in a little bit. All right, and then the other people involved. So here's some pictures also from 2006. A young Gwen with her hosts in the village. And this is the house that I stayed in for most of my field work. And then there's son Kunga, who has been a fantastic research assistant for me since 2006, and now is doing a PhD in linguistics at the University of Sydney. And I swear it's not because I had to twist his arm into it. He actually approached me about wanting to do it a few years ago, and somehow managed to happen. Other people that we worked with, I guess in the last decade, Karma Tenzin, who helped a lot with transcription and translation. He also had worked as a reporter, so could bring those skills into the project. Kencho Juma, who was from the southern Kurtöp speaking region, so helped me get data from another area that I wasn't living in. We've got an interview from her that I was hoping to show you, but I don't think it works over Zoom. And then some college students we worked with, Jeremy Tenzi, a guy who helped collect some stories. Just some nice pictures from the area. You see what it's like going across the river there, to one of my favorite people that I ever worked with, Tsering Somo, in Jasabi village, and there she is feeding salt to her cow. All right, and so this is the sort of data that we get, storytellers with native speakers doing the recording, storytellers with an outsider, me primarily, or it could be a Dzongkha speaker doing a recording, historical narratives, personal narratives, interviews, conversations, anything that I happen to overhear, procedural recordings, so people explaining how things work, and then any sorts of recordings going on in the village. And so for most of my PhD fieldwork, I was there for a year to be able to get everything, what happens across all the seasons. And I wanted to show a few examples. I think only one's going to work, unfortunately. And is it not that one? There we go. All right, so it's a tiny video here of a villager, Karma Zangpo, starting a narration.
Lasula. Da Marigi, say, Motti, Dordis Shumanen, say, Tambaram, say, Marigi, Kesakepo, said Kutigio, you tabi, Niven, Tonk, tabi Niven.
I'm just going to stop it there. I don't know if you guys can see, but he's you know, he's been dressed up into a go. It's made a very formal situation. He actually looks a little bit nervous. If you know him, you could see that. And he's throwing this honorific law in there that the villagers don't normally use. This is a Tibetan borrowing. And he actually uses another Tibetan word, and he has to stop and correct himself and say the Kurtöp word. So there's a really different register happening here when an outsider is doing a recording in this sort of context. Now, if the green recording worked, I would be able to contrast this with what happens when a local villager is just talking to her village friends. It's a different type of language altogether. Anyway, so the point is, when you're doing a documentation project, you really want to try to get everything. So that's what we've done. And now we can talk about all the beautiful stuff that comes out of the language when you've really tried to get stuff for a dictionary, collect all these texts, get all the different types of data, and see what emerges from the language. And I will try to go through this quickly. So what I have here is perfective aspect suffixes. If you're not a linguist, you can think about this more or less as similar to past tense. So like in English, if I've said, you know, something was completed, I could say, I ate, I have eaten, I would have eaten, but blah, blah, blah. And those differences mainly just have to do with time and time relative to the speech event. And that's primarily it. Okay, but if you're speaking Kurtöp and you're talking about something that's completed, the first thing you have to do is decide if you're certain about something or not. Now, if you're not certain, you're kind of off the hook. You can just say blah, blah, para. Okay, that's your verb suffix. You're not certain, but you probably think it's completed. All right, if you are certain, now you have to decide whether you've got your own personal knowledge about this event or it's indirect knowledge. So for example, if you were at a party with somebody, you walked in with him, you talked to him, you knew he was there, but after a while you looked around, you didn't see him. You also noted his coat had left. You could say, oh, he's left, but you would use this suffix because you don't have your own knowledge, you're somehow inferring it. Or maybe if somebody had told me this and I'm reporting it to somebody, you could use that one. So it's not your own knowledge. If it is your own knowledge, so something that, you know, primarily maybe you witnessed, or for other reasons, you can say it with that sort of personal knowledge. Again, there's a distinction between whether the knowledge was unexpected or it was not unexpected. So one example of this one is we're sitting on a hill outside a village, and there's paragliders flying around. Kids had not seen a person flying around in a paraglider before. And basically every event that the guy did was uttered with na. Oh, look, he's turned the corner, na. Oh, look, he's landed, na. This is all, everything about it is unexpected, but you're witnessing it, so it's this unexpected na. And then if it's not unexpected, then you have to decide really whether this is knowledge unique to you or whether other people like the person you're talking to would know it. So if I'm talking about myself and I'm talking to you and you were away and you don't know anything about my life in the past, couple of months, I'll just use this shang everywhere because I know you don't know and it's all information to you. But if I'm talking about somebody else and they would know, obviously have knowledge about themselves, I would use this form. Or sometimes you can use this form when talking about yourself. If you're like talking about something that happened in the past to say to somebody else, but there's a third person in the conversation who was there with you, so you can't really claim the knowledge as your own. That person next to you shares it, then you would have to use pala. Okay, so this is just the imperfective aspect, my best sense of how all these different suffixes work. And over here is some tables I put together from that are in a publication. So here's the perfective aspect suffix that I've explained to you, but there's similar things happening in imperfective. So if the aspect is happening right now or ongoing, if it's happening in the future again, and then there are these other things that you can tack on if you're not being precise enough with any of these, you can add these as well. And then these things down here, these are copulas, which are basically like the to be verbs. So in English, we have to be, and then am, is, are, was, again, depending on person, depending on tense. But all of these ones in Kurtöp are depending on other things similar to this. So how I know, if I'm certain I know, if I think you already know, if I might know, I mean, all of this sort of stuff. So this, trying to give a sense of what it looks like to be a Kurtöp speaker and how you would perceive the world and your interaction and the knowledge with it. All right, and then I think this is really the last content slide here. This is stuff from the dictionary that I've been pulling out. So I've recently gone through this BAT entry inspired by Tony Huber. So this is the entry for Gomchen Pawang. And just to explain what's going on here, this is the Kurtöp. Over here is Dzongkha, and then the Roman Dzongkha based on Wangdi dialect. So this is basically how it's pronounced in Wangdi, and then the English equivalent, and then any information about it. So I've got some nice explanation about how this is a borrowed word in Kurtöp, and how it's linked to a religion that used to be practiced quite actively in the region. Is hardly practiced at all now. This is Tony Huber's work. And then another nice example, Kirman, oil extracted from the ginseng seeds, and I cannot figure out what the scientific name for these seeds is, so I've got to go figure that out at some point. There's a picture of how the Kirman is made with this nice oil press. And then, oh, the numbers, these are really fun. Okay, so here's one way to say 50 Kezoniche, literally 2 20s plus a 10. This reflects an alternative counting system and is less frequently used by native speakers in the village. So if you talk to somebody in the village who hasn't been educated in English, they would say Ke Pedang Sum. But if you talk to somebody who's mostly been educated in English and done most of their counting using a decimal system, they really struggle with this vigesimal system, and they transfer more decimal system onto this vigesimal base and say Kezoniche. So we have had to put both types of speakers are Kurtöp speakers, so we've got both systems reflected in the dictionary. Another case where you've got, here's a word for national identity, Gelkapki Nyota. That's hard for me to say because the village pronunciation would be Jekapki Nyota. But you've got all these people who are so influenced by Dzongkha, they give the Dzongkha pronunciation even when they're speaking their native language. So again, we've got Jekapki forms and then these Gelkapki forms in there. This is just basically showing how the language is being influenced by Dzongkha and other languages. Just one that's kind of culturally fun, Kamsoka, scanty in food and drinks can be used to describe someone who has not been properly fed. For example, if you go to the village, show up at somebody's house in Bhutan, they have to offer you a meal. It's kind of the expected thing, especially if it's at mealtime. So this might be a strategy people employ. Oh, they're really hungry, better go to so-and-so's house, they've got good food. And after a while, you can describe somebody like this. Oh, they come always around mealtime looking hungry. Then you can say Kamsoka to describe them. And then the last entry that I've got in here that I'm showing is another one that I really struggle to translate into English. So it's to be able, like it would translate into English can, or German kann, I guess. But it doesn't quite work that way because there's another word, there's lot, which is this be able, but there's also tsui, which is be able. And it appears the difference between the two is that lot is when something is conceived to be impossible, yet you can still do it. Whereas if tsui is already something is conceived as being possible and you can do it. So, all the way into the lexicon, there are these differences in the language that is really hard for a native English speaker to get out. But of course, for a native Kurtöp speaker, this is just how you speak and perceive language. All right, so now concluding thoughts, I will try to tie all of this back in to the theme of the series. All right, actually what I've done here, I'm not a researcher in colonialism at all, so I've just taken a definition from Wikipedia, and you'll have to forgive me for not being clued in on what people have done. Anyway, there's a definition, a practice or policy of control by one people or power over other people or areas. often by establishing colonies and generally with the aim of economic dominance. And then decolonization is the undoing of colonialism, the latter being the process whereby a nation establishes and maintains its domination of foreign territories, often overseas territories. And this really, it's highly linked in with colonial empires prior to World War I. And I think this is a common understanding of both of these terms. All right, so what about in the context of my research? All right, well, if we think about Bhutan, it's never been officially colonized, but Tibetan, especially the religion and language, have had huge colonizing forces in a way on the people and the language. So they weren't Buddhist, 1,000 years ago. The Hokus still aren't Buddhist, but they're pressured to become Buddhists. English language and to some extent culture is also kind of got a force on Bhutan, even though it's never been colonized by an English-speaking country, but you can see the influence in the vigesimal system, for example, in Kurtöp. So I don't know, that's just raising a question or a point, really. And then about documentary linguistics. So as this really what I've shown you, I hope, is that it aims to take the native speaker viewpoint as its deictic center, kind of its fundamental viewpoint. And in order to do so, relies on mutual collaboration with native speakers from the various areas. Another question, how can documentary linguistics and Bhutanese colonial history inform decolonization theories? And then maybe, the question that I would pose and contribute to the discussion is, let's try to imagine what the world, maybe just particularly the academic world, would look like if we took all the around 7,000 languages as equal worldviews and tried to imagine the world from the Kurtöp perspective with the different perspective aspects, perfective aspects, for example, and then imagining each 7,000 languages has their own different take on knowledge. What could it look like if we could do something with that? Not really an answerable question, but something fun to think about. And I will stop there. Just got some references here. All right, thank you all.